Welcome to this MWC Preview Week webinar on the topic of 2025 and beyond, game-changing deep tech innovations shaping the future of telecom. This session is sponsored by Cambridge Consultants. Thank you for joining us. My name is Joseph Warian. I'm the Asia editor for MWL25. I'm based in Hong Kong, and I'll be moderating this session. Between 2019 and 2025, mobile operators worldwide spent an estimated 1.3 trillion on CapEx, with more than three-quarters allocated to 5G related investments. Throw in fiber deployments, and the sum jumps substantially. And over the last 2 years, operators have a new master to feed, boosting investments in AI projects to enhance their operations and services. While specific figures for the sector vary, the overall trend shows a huge jump in AI-related expenditures. But what do operators have to show for their massive outlays? Revenue growth has stalled in most markets, including many of the most advanced, such as Japan and South Korea, with the outlook not particularly bright. For this session, we have 3 industry experts to discuss what tech innovations are likely to shape the future of telecoms and where they should focus their investments. It's my honor to welcome Dan Kirk, Consulting Director for the Business Advisory Team at Cambridge Consultants, David Ford, a partner at Silverpeak, a London-based investment bank and VC investor, and Peter Jarich, head of GSMA Intelligence, who will start things off with a high-level overview to set the stage. Before I turn things over to Peter, I want to let you know you can submit questions at any point during the session. Look for the box below the slides and type in your query. Over to you, Peter.
Great. Thank you, Joseph, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. Really appreciate the opportunity to share some views and also to answer the questions. I think just to remind everyone what Joseph said, please send in some questions because that always makes for the best conversation. So what I want to do is just to set a stage, right? And I think the title kind of captured it, sort of a discussion that we'll be having around the tech innovation shaping the future of telecom. And I want to provide a little bit of a context about what my team is looking at, which hopefully will lead well into that conversation. So this is, for those of you who don't know, I'm Peter Jarich, so I head up the GSMA Intelligence team. GSMA Intelligence is the research and consulting arm here at the GSMA, and we're lucky enough to work with folks like Cambridge Consultants, to work with different members across the GSMA to understand what's going on. I'm going to provide a bit of an intro into what we're seeing, and then we can take some of these topics further into the discussion. So if I look across the year, and every year, my team puts out a number of reports talking about themes that we expect to be seeing across the year. And this really guides what we'll be looking at in our research agenda. And it's a big list. And don't worry, for those of you who are wondering what you signed up for and if this is going to be a 2-hour or 1 hour webinar, I'm not going to go through all these, but it gives you an idea of what we're looking at, right? The future of network infrastructure, AI, of course, what's taking place with digital industries, and of course the move towards B2B services for operators, the consumer side of 5G, which includes things like FWA, broader consumer technologies. eSIM is a big focus for us, in part because we have some great insights being connected with the GSMA. Obviously, satellites, NTN, big discussions, impact of mobile technologies on societies, on people, which of course wouldn't be possible without spectrum, and of course how this all impacts energy efficiency. It's a lot, right? Because there's a lot going on in the industry. But I want to focus just on a few of these for the conversation today. A few that we think are particularly important, and then hopefully that will drive some great questions, but also drive a lot of a great conversation and discussion with all of you, hopefully. So talk a bit about network transformation, what we're seeing in AI, because everyone's talking about AI, satellites, and then spectrum. So on the network transformation side of things, it's been a huge focus for us. And when you sort of ask why it's a big focus, and I think a lot of folks say, that there's lots of services going on, there's a lot of what's going on. Why are the network technologies so important to you guys and really all of the analysts? And I think this first number really hits it, right? You look at the amount of CapEx that's being spent, and you heard the number that Joseph mentioned. There's a lot of money, right? There's a lot of money being spent on networks, on 5G upgrades, things like 5G SA, right? We see it going slow, but we see the momentum there. And of course, sort of ways we can drive our networks, right? So what are we looking at, right? What's going on with our network agendas? Things like those 5G evolutions that I talked about. How do we see sunsets of 2G and 3G technologies? But then, of course, things like network APIs. How do we expand access to them and make money from them, right? I think a lot of folks know what's going on with Open Gateway, the tremendous success. And you see this percentage, right? Almost 3/4 of connections being covered by it. What does that really mean? And how does it link with things like standalone and 5G advanced? And as we see those technologies getting deployed more and more and more. Of course, I talked about FWA. Really can't think about any network evolutions without thinking about FWA, to the extent that it's been one of the breakout 5G applications that has to fit into the picture as well. Every year, just a bit of a plug here, we work with a number of operators to survey them on their plans. Glad to share some of those insights with anyone afterwards, but expect it's going to be a great part of the conversation at MWC and also hopefully today. AI. I mentioned sort of tongue-in-cheek that we have to talk about AI because everyone's talking about AI, and it's kind of true. I said this a few times, but probably a decade ago when IoT was beginning to get a lot of discussion, I was at a conference and one of my analyst colleagues said, "Hey, I'm here as an IoT analyst because circa," and again it was probably 2015 or so, was saying every analyst is an IoT analyst now, right? Because we're all talking about. I feel it's the same way for AI. Every analyst is an AI analyst because we have to, right? But for us, I think it's also important because what do we see? We see operators engaging with AI. It's not just a question of, hey, this is a cool new technology, what's going to take place with it? We see operators who are engaging with it, testing solutions, deploying solutions, right? Again, about 3/4 actively involved with it. So what are we looking at, right? Obviously, we're all focused on the big trends, but really we should be looking at sort of from a bigger picture story about Gen AI, yes, but broader what's taking place with AI, which includes like how are innovations getting rolled out? How are they impacting services and devices? How are they impacting policies, right? That's something that we know is in the background, but doesn't get talked about a lot. Specifically within telco angle then, there's the question of how do we see those operators deploy? Yes, 75% of operators are testing deployment. What is that testing to deployment? What does that actually look like, and what are they actually doing with it? Of course, the big question from operators is how do we monetize it? Right? Yes, it's nice to be using this in our networks, but how are they making money with it? And as part of that, how are they making money in support of their B2B aspirations? We all know 5G was a big trigger for them to try and push into driving B2B services, supporting digital transformation of enterprises. How is that working? Right? We know enterprises are including AI broadly as part of their digital transformation solutions, right? You see some of this insights from our enterprise surveys, the share of enterprises that are looking at digital transformation, making advanced use of AI, around a third right now. How do telcos play into that? And then, of course, the consumer side of things. How does it fit into the consumer side of the story for operators? Because as much as B2B has been a big aspiration for 5G, we know consumer revenues drive most of the business, most of the sales for operators. There has to be a consumer story there. And there is, to the extent that consumers understand it, right? They understand Gen AI, they're using it. How are operators going to make money off of that? Big question for this year. Great conversation starter. Satellites and NTN. So we started looking at satellites and NTN, several years ago. I think there was a big question several years ago of, well, really two big questions. One, we've seen the boom and bust around satellite launches. Was this going to last this time? Right? Was it going to be just another sort of hey, there's a lot of satellite interest, investment, and then it sort of fades away? Or was it going to last and we're going to see real momentum? And two, how would these new satellite constellations play well with or not play well with operators? Flash forward to 2025, and what do we see, right? We see we're going on that 100 mark for a number of operators that partner with satellite players. It's been several years. We still see the momentum. We still see the interest, right? And so I think this is going to be a continuing conversation throughout the course of this year. And for us, what are we looking at, right? Well, we want to see that transition from building those constellations to actual business momentum. Right? What's taking place now that these solutions are out there? We're not just talking about when the constellations are in place, but what happens now that we're seeing the technologies and those constellations in place. How does that work with telcos, right? That relationship in terms of a covering telco coverage, covering those holes where coverage doesn't exist, and how are operators sort of working at from a commercial strategy. Of course, IoT is a big thing that sometimes doesn't get enough focus, but for us, it's been a big focus. Why? Because as much as there's been a lot of discussion around the device-to-device, connecting your smartphone when you're out of reach of cell service, particularly for emergency services, very, very important, very cool technologies. I think those of you who may have seen the news about the video call that took place here in the UK, I think it was from Wales, where there was no coverage. That's so cool, right? But from an IoT perspective, huge opportunities, right? We're estimating around 2 billion IoT devices that would be addressable from these satellite connectivity services that couldn't be addressed otherwise. And particularly for things when you're looking at remote services, when you're looking at reliability, when you're looking at those redundancy, very, very important. So I think in terms of the last conversation I said and last sort of thing that we are looking at, it's spectrum, right? And spectrum can feel like a bit of a dry topic a lot of times. But it's really important to recognize that it is the lifeblood of mobile services. Without spectrum, the right spectrum, adequate amount of spectrum, we wouldn't be where we are with mobile. So what are we looking at, right? Well, obviously, despite the fact that there's a lot of 5G out there, there's more 5G coming, right? So we know that although there's been 100 countries where spectrum has been made available for 5G, we're going to see more of that. How does that look across the course of the year? How is new spectrum allocated? What do those allocations look like, right? What requirements are put on it? And then how are operators looking at that, and how are regulators looking at what comes beyond 5G, right? We know that WRC27 is just around the corner. What does that look like? Right? Those models, I think, are particularly important. I think this goes sometimes unappreciated, but not every country assigns spectrum in the same way. So what trends are we seeing? Right? What obligations are put on there? What are regulators doing to make sure that spectrum is put to use, and what sort of burdens do those put on the operators deploying it? Of course, that sort of thinks about in terms of a spectrum management side of things. It plays a little bit into the questions of what do we see with energy efficiency? How can we think about linking those two things? And then, of course, big topics, spectrum for verticals. Where do we see regulators? Where do we see countries assigning spectrum specifically for things like verticals? What value do they get out of that? What proof points do we see? Because we know there's a lot of interest out there. But what does that really look like when the rubber hits the road? Of course, millimeter wave, big topic. We know that's been a big focus for 5G, a big promise. We've seen a number of countries globally, 23 as of Q3 last year, that have assigned it. Where will we see those extra assignments, and where do we see the deployments? And then, of course, and I mentioned this before, sunsets, right? 2025 looks to be one of the biggest year for sunsets of spectrum, refarming spectrum for new services, going away from 2G and 3G to 4G and 5G. How do those actually take place, and how does that spectrum get put to use? So with that, I know it was quick. I'm hoping that we'll have a much better conversation, much longer conversation as I hand it back to Joseph. And so with that, let me hand it back to you, Joseph.
Thank you, Peter. Fantastic overview into the various deep tech topics we are going to approach in this discussion. Deep tech is certainly a broad term, covering everything from AI to non-terrestrial networks, or NTNs, to quantum and advanced computing. First question is, from your perspective, which deep tech area should telco leaders prioritize for investment over the next 5 years? Let's start with Dan.
Thank you, Joseph. Good afternoon, everybody. This is kind of very relevant for us. Cambridge Consultants is a deep tech specialist advisory company, part of the Capgemini Invent Group. And we have a very large communications practice that works from the satellites right down to some of the semiconductors in the networks and kind of all parts in between. So for us, I think there are probably 3 key themes that are going to underpin growth. Obviously, AI. And here, I think you have to start unpicking practical use cases and demonstrating where the value comes. And that comes at the level of customer experience. There's some really insightful developments there about how you link not just information about the network but user needs. I think it's in the operations of the network. So we're seeing a lot of movement towards use of AI in autonomous networks and self-healing networks, and how you actually drive efficiency and performance. And then it's right down in the nuts and bolts of the hard engineering of how some of these networks work, new compute platforms, new AI tools, and we're going to see developments there coming over time. And I expect all three to be part of the debate MWC. NTNs, I think this is a huge opportunity. I think we're in a transformational moment where people are going to expect to have universal coverage. And the question is really to what quality and depth and at what cost. And then I think the other area that I think is really going to be seen innovation is we are starting to see an evolution of the next generation of radio networks. And you mentioned MIMO, you mentioned new spectrum, you mentioned new antennas. I think the new networks, partly on the journey to 6G, are going to be much more adaptable, much more focused on optimizing use of spectrum and performance. So I think we're going to see opportunities in all those areas. And actually, we've published our contribution to the debate today. We have launched our white paper on 5 deep tech areas of innovation opportunity, which I think you can all download either from the resources section or contacting us on our website. But hopefully that provides some insight as well. And please reach out to us with your comments and thoughts.
Thanks, Dan. That's certainly a wide array of technology and a bit daunting for the CFO as he manages his CapEx budget. David, can you add your insight into that broad topic, and then we'll start to narrow down into some of the specific silos there.
Yeah, sure. So look, good to meet everybody, and good afternoon. So I'm David Ford, a partner at Silverpeak in London. We're an advisory firm. We work with mostly European technology companies, helping them with M&A or growth financing rounds. And we do a lot in the software and services area, but probably half of what we do is in deep tech. So that's in things like robotics and semiconductors and quantum and satellites and so on. So I guess I'm approaching this from a perspective of how the investors that we deal with, when we're putting funding rounds together, how they're looking at the market, what they are thinking is hot, and what's interesting, and what telecoms operators should be, well, the telecoms market in general should be thinking of and focusing on. So Dan ran through a good few areas there. I think I guess to the question around if I was a telecoms carrier, what would I be focusing on? I think one of the areas I'd be thinking of is in security, so particularly around quantum security. So as everybody's aware that the quantum computing technology is moving on and making progress. I think the general perception is that's further away. I think our perception, having been very active in the sector in the compute and networking and cybersecurity area, I think based on that, I think we think it's a bit quicker. It'll arrive a bit quicker than people think, due to some of the developments in various kind of quantum modalities that are going on. And everybody would have seen late last year Google's Willow developments, which spurred all the listed quantum entities to significant increases in their stock prices in the last quarter. And I think that kind of shows that actually some of this quantum compute technology is quicker, is going to happen earlier than we think. And that means that actually a lot of the focus is now will start to shift to more so to security, because everybody needs to figure out, well, if this harvest now and decrypt later problem is more immediate, then we need to start quantum encrypting our stuff as it goes across networks. And I think so I think for telecoms operators there is a very good opportunity, and I think telecoms operators are always looking for a good revenue opportunity, right? And I think providing quantum encryption through quantum key distribution, for example, across on data that enterprises are shifting around, can be a very premium service. And I think that can add, you can add an extra 25%, who knows, 50%, who knows how sensitive the customer is to that. But I think there's a good opportunity in quantum encryption, certainly. Number one.
I would just really quickly, Joseph, I would just to add on to what David was saying. I think it's a really good point when we go out and I talked about how we talk to operators on the network plans, security, end user security, network security, number one, right? One of their highest priorities. It's been the top. Sort of it vacillates between number one and number two for the last few years. But what I think is really important was the sort of this idea that David was mentioning in terms of people think, well, it's far away, right? We don't need to worry about quantum. Quantum's still far away. As much as, even if that's true, the timescales for implementing things in telecom networks, whether that's with specifications, whether it's with standards, whether it's processes, these are networks. I mean, these are networks and processes that don't change overnight. And so even if we are looking at something that is several years away, we need to be planning for that now and making those plans now, or else, it will be here in no time. And so I think that David's right that it is probably picking up faster than a lot of people think. And depending upon...
And you need more time.
Yeah, depending upon the life cycle of your data, right? Yes, some data does not have a long life cycle of being particularly sensitive. Some does, right? And so if you're seeing that data harvested now, we need to be thinking about that now. So it's a critical point.
Wow. Yeah, thanks for chiming in there. I had a follow-up question on that exact topic for David, because it seems that, like many other technologies in the past, quantum, it's sort of like fusion. It's next decade, right? But it's a lot closer than that. So yeah, and that there's sort of a revenue stream, not guaranteed, but obviously optimistic there.
And I think actually, and I think carriers, telecoms operators are well placed, to benefit from that, because, although we've seen a lot of the banks and big enterprises more recently setting up internal quantum teams to make sure that they're covered on this, I think the telecoms operators are well placed to squeeze some more revenue out of services there. So.
Great. I want to move on to the what likely is the most hyped tech for a long time, and also one of the most in the news deep tech, and that's of course AI, and made all the more interesting by China's release of DeepSeek just weeks ago, which created quite a jolt to the industry. So AI is often cited as a game changer for telcos, but many implementations so far focus on cost savings rather than revenue growth. How can operators use AI to create real competitive differentiation and new revenue streams? Peter, why don't you, since we left you out, why don't you start on that one?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think, and that is really the angle that we see. It is this AI monetization angle. Right now, I want to be clear. I kind of dismissed a little bit some of what's being done with, say, chatbots and customer support. Because if you think about it, right, customer care, customer experience is part of how you generate revenues. Right, if you can monetize it by delivering a better customer experience, by decreasing churn, right, penny saved is a penny earned. Obviously, anything you can do to keep those customers happy, and AI and support of networks and services is definitely part of that. But as I was taught very early on, you can't sort of save your way to growth. And sort of growth requires sort of new ideas of how do I monetize this. And so we're seeing a bunch of different opportunities. We're seeing a bunch of different things being tried by telcos. And I think it's encouraging to see the number of things that are being tried. So in the news, we all would have seen a lot of the GPU as a service solutions that are being deployed or trialed or planned for, right? Where telcos are saying, will they invest in GPUs, offer that as a service? Now, to some extent, you're seeing that being driven by some sovereign AI, requirements, where let's say a country needs to make sure that those workloads stay in their country, but a telco is in a great place to roll some of that out, right? You're seeing things like AI factories, where particularly focused on things like B2B, where you see telcos invest in some AI capabilities and help enterprises, help other folks develop new applications. But you're even just seeing the most basic things of kind of what I'm calling sell-through. Right, we'll all remember when the video services became a big deal. It was always an easy way to tack on Netflix to your tack on Netflix, and the telco takes a bit of a cut. Netflix takes more of a cut. You're seeing a number of the operators partner with some of the AI innovators to sell their services through to their customers, serve as a conduit for them. I think your example of DeepSeek is a good one. And what I mean is a good one is that this is just the start, right? So this is the start of some of the stuff that we're seeing now. Who knows what we're going to see in terms of new business models going forward. But yeah, it is that I think that monetization side of things, kind of like the 5G monetization, built out the 5G networks. Now we got to figure out how we make money from them. I think we're going to see that AI monetization being the story of this year.
Yeah.
Before I turn it over to Dan, I want to just bring up a story I wrote today about SK Telecom in South Korea. The Q4 earnings, bright side, AI-related revenue up 30%. It's hard to compare year on year because it really wasn't much going on last year. But whatever, let's just forgive that and then move on to their forecast, their guidance, revenue guidance for 2025, flat. So I looked at those numbers for longer than I care to admit, trying to figure out how does it, you had growth and then, but the telco business is flat. It's flat. So it just seems that it's a bit of a disconnect for me. So Dan.
Well, I'll throw this out there and let Dan and David respond, because I'll just throw that the hard question out to them. You're right about the telco business sort of in general being flat and the issues of how does AI fit against that. There's also that investment question, right? Because if you look at the sums being invested by governments, by the cloud players, by the AI innovators, we're talking about billions upon billions of investment, which are numbers that a lot of telcos sort of look at, and again, against a flat revenue base is sort of hard to sometimes figure out. So I think that's the other challenge here of how do we balance the investment needs against that monetization. But Dan and David are going to tell us how that works, because they have that answer.
Yeah, it's always a challenge to telecoms, isn't it? Because you sort of underpin everything. There is no AI, there is no cloud, there is no streaming, there is no video conferencing without telecoms, and yet, a lot of the revenue growth seems to come from the other sectors. I think with AI, a couple of observations. I think what DeepSeek has shown is that smart application of AI tools is where you really drive the value. It isn't just an enormous volume of throwing weight at large language models and training and inference. It's actually intelligent insight in how you apply AI to the tools and the problems. And we're seeing some really interesting models in operations inside telecoms operators, where people are starting to use those multi-agent models and reinforcement learning to optimize issues and performance. How do I route net dynamically? How do I consider energy consumption? What bits of the network I can turn off and turn on again to optimize performance? And I think we'll see more and more learnings and examples of that as they drive performance. And that's intelligent use of AI models for the right problem. I think the other thing I would say, although you can't sort of cut cost to growth, I think there is a general trend across the industry, and 5G and software-defined networks and cloud models and AI is part of this, to build that sort of more dynamic, more responsive network that can actually provision what the customer needs when they want it. And having worked in an operator and a vendor, it's not easy, but those operators that have managed to build that flexibility do have a real advantage. And you can start to provision for customers, particularly the business customers, more dynamically, more cost effectively, more quickly, and you build advantage that way. And I think you are starting to see some differentiation between those operators in that space. And AI will be part of how they do that, definitely. As to the monetization of AI, we've talked about edge selling for a while and it hasn't quite come off. I think the best story I've seen is the telcos will have to show the world how they're using that AI capacity. And if they can show the world that they can use that AI capacity, maybe they can sell it on to other people. But it will transform how the networks operate. And I think the people who get that right will have an advantage.
Yeah. And actually, Joseph, that's what you mentioned about SK is funny, because they're one of the few players who have an AI consumer kind of offering. I can't remember what it's called, begins with A. But yeah, and but I guess it's funny that they're not projecting any growth from that. But separately, I think general use of AI. I think within telcos, clearly, I'd be in the camp of, well, let's try and squeeze more out of what we've got necessarily, rather than necessarily creating brand new services that we've got to go out and sell. So that's kind of, I'm thinking there, fraud protection, revenue protection, that kind of stuff, which ought to be using AI with the data that's collected from network, generated by networks, ought to be a good route. But then I think the most obvious area is really, for me, is around kind of network allocation optimization. So can you optimize certain traffic over others? Can you charge more, therefore, for certain traffic rather than others? And that suddenly starts to move you out of being a dumb pipe into something more valuable. And I think that ought to be super attractive to carriers in general. So.
Yeah, definitely. It's a good segue to the next question. Is that with increasing levels of network automation, how do you see the balance between automation and human oversight evolving? With fully autonomous networks, will fully autonomous networks ever be a reality, or will human decision making always be needed? Dan, let's give that to you.
Yes, I mean, when we looked at this with Capgemini over the last year, at the moment, probably less than 10% of network operators are close to any level of sort of credible autonomy, though they are starting trials and programs. And most of that involves informing someone to make an ultimate decision. But as you get to more complicated network scenarios, and as you have more dynamic elements in the radio and choices, you won't be able to sort of rely on human oversight for all of it. You will have to trust and depend on the AI tools to guide you and then make the right decision making. So one of the key things we're seeing at the moment is a lot of operators testing, trialing, getting the right data, getting the right process in place to really understand and validate where and how they can rely on the network performance. But I think actually those operators that can put that in place, and you've seen some really interesting early successes, they do have a much, not just a lower cost network, but a higher performing network, and they're able to adapt to customer needs more quickly. So I think you are going to see a greater and greater move towards more autonomy, more independence of control of networks. I think as long as we're on that journey, we are putting in the tests and the trials. I think that will be an inevitability of how more and more networks are run and operated.
Right. Peter, do you want to contribute on that? I can tell you do.
So, I mean, I think what I think the interesting question is, you talked about putting out there, if we'll get to a point where it's a fully autonomous network. I think we sometimes think of it from a consumer perspective of it's one big network. It's not. I mean, every network is multiple different domains, multiple different parts. And so I think that, when we think about a point where will everything just sort of be run by a bunch of different agents, some master agent working with other agents who, probably not, but will particular domains of the network be run autonomously and at a certain granular level? Yeah, probably. Is that going to be taking place soon? Probably not. I mean, I know that there's been a bunch, at least in 2024, there were a number of announcements of some level 4 autonomy taking place in a number of networks. And so I think that we'll see more and more of that. But I think it's sort of wrong to think about this big, massive automation of the entire network versus certain domains. And I think Dan hit it right. One of the things that we don't talk enough about is that AI really requires us to have all those data sources figured out, right? And I mean, I remember those conversations early on with a number of operators saying, no. AI is going to mean we don't need to have our data sources figured out because AI is going to figure that out for us. Well, no, not if you really want it to work in the way. If you're trying to automate certain things and have it work well, you need to have your data sources figured out, clean data, the right data to work from. And so I think as we sort through that, then you'll be able to see what domains, what segments of the network can you have more autonomy in. And then, but I think it'll be a while before we get to Skynet. Hopefully.
Yeah.
Fingers
crossed.
Definitely.
And I think just to add to that, I think it's a bit like there's a bit of an analogy with the autonomous driving scenario here, which has had hundreds of billions gone into it, and yes, we're making progress, but it's been slower. But I think you need to get all exactly as you say, Peter. I think you need to get all the data sources sorted out, and it will be in pieces, and rather than a big bang solution. And autonomous driving has taken off, for example, in bounded environments like quarries and airports and these kind of things, not necessarily on the open roads. And I think that's equating to your sort of different islands of usage, perhaps.
Yeah.
Just building on that, I think it's interesting. This is one where operators can differentiate, because although many of the vendors, I'm having it for a vendor as well, they will provide solutions and learnings based on their equipment. Most networks are not single vendor. Most domains have complex interactions. So it depends on how you as an operator have implemented in the vendor mix. So you have to train on your own network implementation. So those operators that do that, I think, have an opportunity. And I think it will be, as you say, probably private networks are a good example for a closed environment, maybe with business critical performance where actually real-time decision making is a key, so you can't rely on people, where you'll see some of these early autonomous networks.
Mm-hmm. We're about 35 minutes into this, so I want to bring in some of the audience questions. We got quite a few in. There's a real simple question. How important is latency supporting the future of telecoms? Anybody want to take that? Latency.
I'll have a go at that. I think it's interesting. It's a debate I was having with a client recently. In the radio network in particular, we've actually started to disaggregate many of the elements of the radio network with moves to vRAN, ORAN, blah, 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 and start to talk a bit more about functions and their requirements and where they need to happen. So, you can have a conversation about multiple MIMO control or forward error correction, all these functions and what has to happen where in the network. And then you start getting in quite precise conversations. Well, actually, I would love to do that in the cloud, but that requires a latency of this to deliver this kind of performance. So I think we're actually be able to start understanding and really targeting where key functions need to happen, what latency is needed to give the experience, and what, frankly, can be done and managed in different locations. And that allows you as an operator to really think about the experience you want to offer, because it's very much application or function dependent whether you need latency or not. But I think it's coming into how people are designing new architecture. So talking about cloud networks or AI networks, the processing and what happens in the latency are really key parts of that decision-making process.
I'll move on to the next question from the audience. What do you this relates to the one about security earlier. What do you think will be the breakthrough in deep tech in the sector of cybersecurity to help telcos? Dan? Sorry, David?
Yeah, I guess to my earlier point, I think it is just it's production level potential for quantum key distribution and so on. So whether it's distributed via metro fiber networks over short range or satellite over long range, and so there's a lot of technologies stacking up there, sort of optical satellite links, the entangled quantum photon sources, all that kind of there's a lot of things stacking up which are active and running now, but getting that in production quality, I guess, is the challenge. So.
Okay. Anybody else want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think there's, to build on that, Dave, I think there's some really interesting stuff on quantum networking, but it's quite hard, as you said, with the entangled photons and things that way beyond my pay grade. And then there's using the quantum key distribution for sort of security control. I think that's become more of a more immediate concern. And again, interesting conversations sort of in terrestrial networks, also particularly in satellites, where you mentioned some of the intersatellite links and optical links. I think people are getting increasingly concerned about the level of security in satellites. And I think that might be one where there's going to be a renewed focus in the next year or two.
Okay, great. So moving on, NTN's promise global coverage, but what what are the biggest roadblocks to scaling these networks commercially? Is there a challenge? Is the challenge more technological, regulatory, or business model related? I think I'll ask David that question.
Yeah, look, I think satellite networks have moved on, I think, dramatically in the last couple of years. And if you'd asked people 5 years ago, said, look, we're going to be potentially connecting, standard handsets to satellites, it was in the realms of fantasy, And I actually remember 5 years ago somebody talking to me about that, and I said, how can that ever happen? So. Just from a technical perspective, but look, but I think things have changed a lot. You've got the sort of traditional satcom players who have all historically proprietary solutions, proprietary handsets, and that the mentality of those groups is changing a lot. Both, if you look at people like Iridium, who've said we're moving towards standards-based approaches now going forward. We've got execs coming in, like the new CEO at SES is a GSM. He's a mobile guy, right? So that's a change of heart. So I think that what's the issue? Is it technology or whatever? I think the technology piece is coming. We got release 17, release 18, and so on for non-terrestrial networks, meaning that you can connect to satellite using 3GPP compliant devices. And so I think the battle is more going to be around, or the issue is going to be more around regulatory and spectrum and that kind of thing. So you've got a split now between various players doing kind of proprietary type solutions like the Apple Globostar thing, which I think are sort of moving towards standards. And then I think where it's going to end up is a standards type solution for this. But then you've got the other axis, which is what spectrum are they going to use? Are they going to use terrestrial spectrum or MSS spectrum? And I think there's different camps there. You've got people like AST and Starlink and so on doing stuff with T-Mobile and everybody else. And using terrestrial spectrum, there's issues with that because you risk interference and that kind of thing. So I think then you've got people like Globalstar with MSS and so on. So I think that's probably more going to be a long-term answer, the MSS type solution. But there's various ways and means to get there. And yeah, so an interesting market. I think there's lots of players in this right now, lots of different types of solutions. I think that I think people are overestimating, as people usually do, the utility of these solutions. I think it'll be initially messaging, emergency, that kind of stuff. Not, I know they did the Wales Hilltop video call, but I think the capacity requirements for that are just going to be horrendous. And AST Space Mobile are doing a great job, but and their share price has gone through the roof, right? But I think if you look at what they've got to roll out in order to get proper service for voice and video, and the scale of those satellites is enormous, and the capital requirement is enormous. So I think it'll be starting earlier with kind of messaging IoT stuff, and then move much later on to the sort of video streaming stuff that we all talked about, 3G in 1998 or whatever it was, using terrestrial. So that's my sort of thought. I guess the other axis is, I think it'll need to be using the network operators as a conduit to the users as well, rather than direct. I mean, you've got Apple doing stuff with Globostar, kind of direct to the user, but I think ultimately the channel that will be through the network operators too.
So when can we expect a consolidation to start?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a short term or a short to medium, and then a longer term. And that short to medium term is when Apple are already committed to Globalstar when it was 1.7 billion or whatever they've put in, and that's going to happen, and then that will migrate over time. But that'll be I guess the consolidation will be in a couple of years' time, 2-3 years' time.
I would just add two really quick things. I think David's example of Iridium is a great one. because in some of what they're doing, right, there is that standard, the technology side of things of how they're evolving what they're doing. There's also the business model side of things of looking at sort of, we all remember Iridium, originally in the business model, but now looking at things like IoT as a business model, I think you see that business as well as the technology. But the regulation side of things, I think, is interesting, not just from spectrum, because David's 100% right. That's going to be a fight that we're going to see across the course of the year. But things like also, how do regulators and governments look at satellite as part of their resiliency schemes, right? Network resiliency is a increasingly important deal, right? It's not for nothing that we see some governments also talking about shutting down and shooting down satellites, right? And when that takes place, we sort of understand sort of not just in natural disasters, but resiliency in case something happens to your national network. But then also, I think in terms of just how the satellite providers are regulated compared to operators. I think that's one thing that we haven't really discussed much, but the regulations in terms of how they deliver services may differ between a satellite provider and a telco. I think we're going to start to see some more conversation about that, because if there's a question of if everyone's on a level playing field, that's obviously something that we're going to need to look at. And I think we'll hear more of that over the course of the year.
I'm just coming in on that. I think that's a very good point, Peter. I think, there are some capacity and technical limitations satellites. It's phenomenally complicated to do what they've done with these satellites moving at the speeds they do. There are other options coming in. I think there are the how to do platform companies which have the advantage of national control, national boundaries, and use of spectrum. So some countries are quite liking that ability. There's also a sort of whole kind of ecosystem evolving. So it won't just be communications. It will be control of drones. It will be control of emergency services networks above the ground. So there's a whole sort of communications ecosystem that's going to need to develop as well, which have a mixture of kind of regulation and spectrum control and other things as well. And the final thing I'd say is, the other one innovations in satellite that's really transforming is we've talked a bit before about inter-satellite links and optical links between satellites. There's some really interesting innovations about inter-satellite links down to ground, never to your handset, but they certainly give you a level of capacity in downlinks that you didn't have before, which people are looking at quite interestingly as part of satellite, as part of a wider resilience to other networks in the countries. So I think this sort of non-terrestrial network is going to become a really quite complicated and sophisticated interplay of technologies in the future. And you're right, but regulation is going to be key to getting it right.
Thanks. I want to move on to the final question, and that's perhaps the most exciting, is that what are we looking for at MWC 2025 Barcelona? What's going to make waves there? So why don't we start with Peter?
I think metaverse. I think this is the year for the metaverse. Clearly, it's like I woke up, several years ago. I mean, in terms of what's going to make news, I really hope it's going to be seeing some of the ideas of how operators are monetizing that AI. Again, I think we all know AI is going to be such a big focus. And don't get me wrong, right? I mean, my team's running a summit on NTN. We're running an executive roundtable around IoT and NTN. Huge, right? I think that last bit of the conversation, there's so much to unpack there on NTN. I think we'll see a lot this year. But AI, we know it's going to dominate, just because it's the investments being made, the impact it could have, just the fact that everyone kind of has to talk about it. So what I hope we see are good examples of how that takes place. And then I think it's going to be that question of how do we distribute it, right? How are we distributing AI, and how are we building networks to support it? Because that's a conversation that I think, last year at MWC was a big conversation, right? This idea of AI for networks for AI, but we haven't seen that networks for AI part really get a lot of focus. Likewise, there was sort of bubbling up of conversation of inferencing at the edge. How do we move from having all these AI workloads being in the cloud to pushing them out closer to the user, not just for latency, because I know there was a question around latency, but data security, reliability, right? If you have to have that connection to the cloud and that goes down, how do you ensure that you still have those AI workloads running? And again, you run on the device, and even costs. Anyone who has looked at the AWS revenues knows they make a lot of money from doing stuff in the cloud. So if you can keep stuff on device, so I think that's going to be a big topic this year. And looking forward to it.
Yeah. Thanks, Peter. David?
Yeah, sorry, my internet connection dropped there for a moment. Hope I didn't
Glad
miss
to have you
anything.
back.
MWC. So, I mean, last year was all AI hype, wasn't it? Hopefully this year, I think, as Peter says, it'll be a bit more AI sort of what can we actually do? What's the opportunity? And actually, Peter, you talked about metaverse, slightly tongue in cheek, but actually, we've actually been seeing a lot of activity in AR and VR stuff coming on just recently, and I think that in the sort of earlier stage, i.e. the sort of hardware, the glasses, the this, that, the other, which will obviously feed through as well. So that might be a little blast from the past, because there was a big hype in AI, in AR, VR, and metaverse stuff, and that kind of went away. But I think it'll start to come back.
Over to you, Dan.
Yeah, a couple of things. I'm hoping we're a bit more optimistic than we have been in the last few years at MWC. Nice to be sort of on the front foot with interesting ideas. I think AI will be part of that. I do think, back to an earlier point I made, I think people will start to be looking and talking about networks in a much more, in a different way. We will be talking a little bit about 6G, but it'll be much more as a software trajectory and how that's deployed. And those operators that have moved to a better architecture will be talking, I think, quite bullishly about their ability to introduce new services and upgrade on a different cycle. And that will be driving through into how the operators tell their story as well. I think, we've gone are the days of the big 4G to 5G to 6G hardware refresh cycles. And I think we'll see a bit more about how that is, how operators and how the industry plans to move through the technology developments and separate out that cycle. But I think the other one is just AI everywhere, but it's got to be real this time. What can you actually do with it?
Wow. So I think that's all the time we have. I just want to do a quick wrap up. And looking at the deep tech areas are vast, as we pointed out earlier. And I wish it would be easy to advise telcos that they could put all their eggs in one basket over there like they did in the past. But that's just not the reality we face, and it's not just two baskets, and probably not even three. And so it's complex, complicated, and but I think that there is hopefully light at the end of the tunnel with some of these network efficiency games, value-added services which can be upselled, and etc. Dan, any final remarks before we sign off?
No, other than say, I think you summarised it well. I think that there's a lot to play for here in the industry, and as I said, we underpin so much of the future of the tech industry. So, many more innovations to come.
All right. Well, fantastic. I want to thank Dan, David, and Peter for your insight, and also the audience for your participation and your wonderful questions. Sorry we couldn't get to all of them. If you didn't get a response, we can reply offline. Oh, and Dan, one last thing. Your report, I understand you're publishing a report this morning.
Yes.
And I guess the users can download it by going to the resources section.
In the resources section, also they can find it on the Cambridge Consultants website as well. So it's our view of those 5 key deep tech trends that you can use for future growth in the industry.
Fantastic. Well, thanks, everybody.